Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming. And can I just say how delighted I am to be here in Winchester with you, because I got married in Winchester. My kids were born in Winchester. My first house was in Cannon Street, far too close to the Wickham Arms. We then moved out near Alresford to Cheriton. So I feel I'm on home territory. And the main reason I I'm lucky enough to get a lot of invitations, and I just wanted to come back to Winchester, and I kind of felt a little swell in my heart as I came off at Junction 9 on the M3, wiggled my way round the roundabout and came down into Winchester again, which is the most wonderful city. So thank you all so much for coming. What I plan to do is I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and I'm going to open it up for questions. And frankly, if people get bored of me halfway through and you want to ask a question, feel free, although that might be difficult for microphones and all of that point of view. I thought I'd try and talk about kind of why I wrote the book and what the drivers behind it, I think, are about why Britain feels a somewhat stranger place than I'd anticipated. So I moved in 2014 with my wife and the dog to Washington, D.C. We lived in Georgetown, and when we left, there was this sort of coalition government in Britain of the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, and it all felt very normal. I got out to America. Barack Obama was the US president. Again, it felt very normal. And then the world went slightly mad, and I kind of tried to unpick what happened in that time. And I came back in 2022 from the beginning of 2022, after 8 years in Washington. And in 2022, it seemed like Britain went mad. And I'm old. The first election I voted in was the 1979 general election, which saw the end of Jim Callaghan, the winter of discontent, kind of people wanted a new start with Margaret Thatcher. For the next 28 years of my life, I knew 3 prime ministers. There was Margaret Thatcher, there was John Major, and there was Tony Blair. 1979 to 2007. It was an extraordinary period. I come back in 2022, and we have 3 prime ministers in 1 year. And you think, well, something funny is going on here if that is what is going on. Now, so I went with Donald Trump. I travelled with Donald Trump. I travelled a lot with Donald Trump. I travelled with Donald Trump to his golf course in Turnberry in Scotland on June the 24th, 2016, which was the day after the Brexit vote. And Trump was there. In Trump's telling of the story, of course, he arrived on the 22nd of June, the day before Brexit, and told everybody assembled that I think that Britain will vote for Brexit, and then sure enough, they followed me, and they did vote for Brexit. Actually, he didn't arrive on the 22nd, he arrived on the 24th. But those are small quibbles and details that I won't allow myself to be, and Donald Trump's relationship with the truth is maybe something we will return to, because I do think it says something about the age we live in. And I think Donald Trump, was on the 9th tee at Turnberry with the lighthouse hole behind him. And he thought, my God, if Britain could do something as crazy and as nuts, and I'm not making a judgment about Brexit, well, I am really, but I'm not really making a judgment about Brexit, but it just seemed like, well, we'd had 50 years of a relationship with the European Union. Normally in politics, what happens is that people tiptoe up to the edge, look over the edge and think, oh, that looks scary down there, and they take 6 paces back. And in 2016, Britain went up to the edge and thought, yeah, let's hold hands and jump. And so we did with Brexit. And so we upset a relationship that had been as part of our life for half a century and completely redefined what our economic priorities would be. And we voted for Brexit. And I think Donald Trump saw that as the light bulb moment when he thought, well, if boring old staid conservative small c Britain can vote for Brexit, they sure as hell can vote for me as the next president of the United States of America. And so in 2016, you get Donald Trump being elected. He had never held office. He had never served in the military. This was the first time in 240 years since the foundation of the United States of America that they'd ever done something like that. Normally, you know, you'd been a governor, or you'd been a senator or a congressman, or you'd served, you know, like Eisenhower at the highest level of the armed forces, and you were a military hero. Donald Trump had done none of that. He was a draft dodger. He had these bone spurs in his foot that got him out of having to serve in the military. He was a property tycoon. And, you know, I kind of did think, when I talk about Donald Trump a lot. I would love a day of my life where Donald Trump is not somewhere in my consciousness. But you know, and Donald Trump, you know, married 3 times, 5 children from the 3 marriages. I'm not making any judgment about that. But I would say that if Barack Obama had been married 3 times with 5 children from 3 different marriages, I think the judgment on him might be slightly different. I travelled with Trump to the Middle East on his first Middle East tour. And we went to Saudi Arabia first. And the Saudis put on this unbelievable show for him. I'd flown actually a year earlier, 2 years earlier, with Obama to Saudi on Air Force One, which, if you're thinking about which airline you'd like to travel, and you're thinking EasyJet, Ryanair, or Air Force One, I'd go Air Force One. Just saying. I mean, we landed at Stansted Airport. Plane comes to a halt. 20 minutes later, I'm in the back garden of the US ambassador's residence in Regent's Park. It's the way to go. No passport control. Marine One lifts up, 3 other helicopters, and we land in the back garden. It's a good way to travel. Trump goes to Saudi Arabia, and they put on a fantastic show for him and make him, you know, they knew how to just schmooze him, just love him, just adore Donald Trump, and he will adore you back. And my daughter's ex-partner had been part of the Saudi organization of the trip. And one of the things they did was, do you remember when Donald Trump was running for office, that, I don't know why I'm digressing down stories, and I haven't even talked about my book yet, but anyway, we'll get back to the book, that Marco Rubio had made this jibe that Donald Trump has small hands, he must there be small elsewhere. And the Saudis, and Donald Trump was infuriated by this, the Saudis at the banquet gave him slightly smaller knives and forks. They were identical in terms, but slightly smaller knives and forks than everyone else, so that when you filmed him eating, it made his hands look bigger. I kid you not. He then flies to Israel, and it's the first time, and we're on Air Force One, and it's the first time it sounds trivial, but it was important in a way, and maybe we'll talk about the politics of today in a minute, but it was the first time that Saudi air traffic control had spoken to Israeli air traffic control. Because normally if you go from Saudi to Israel, you touch down at Cyprus, you don't actually stop, you just touch down so that Cypriot air traffic control take over, you take off again, and then you talk to Israeli air traffic control. Anyway, he flies to Jerusalem, and that night at the dinner, Netanyahu introduces Trump and Melania. And, you know, and the Israelis recognize that they've now got to put on a big show for Trump because of what the Saudis have done. And so the whole cabinet goes to meet Trump at Ben Gurion Airport when Air Force One touches down. And they go to this banquet in Jerusalem in the evening, and Netanyahu introduces him and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and the first wife." No. Close, but no cigar. You could have Trump and the First Lady, or you could have Trump and the third wife, but you can't have Trump and the first wife. And so there was always this element of circus that accompanied Donald Trump wherever he seemed to go. But so anyway, let me come back to the book. And God, it's dull to go back to the book, isn't it? And coming back into Britain. And I think that one of the things that united Trump's election in 2016 and the vote for Brexit, I remember doing a live on the Today programme, and Sarah Montague was presenting before she moved to the World at One. And it was just after Trump had won the nomination the Republican nomination. And I was doing a thing saying, and Sarah's first question was to me, surely Donald Trump cannot win the presidency of the United States of America. That night, the night before, as well as Trump winning the nomination, Leicester City had just won the Premier League title. And that, I said to Sarah, are you kidding? If Leicester City can win the Premier League title they were 3,000 to 1 odds at the start of the season. Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton, of course Donald Trump can win. And may I also say that I thought in the 2016 election, Donald Trump was a far, far superior candidate than Hillary Clinton, who Donald Trump had clear messages. I want to build a wall, I want to keep the Muslims out, I want to, repatriate, redo trade deals, bring back manufacturing. There were a whole series of slogans that just talked to Middle America. And the uniting thing that led to Brexit and that led to Trump, I believe, is the 28 financial crash. When people saw their homes being repossessed, they saw their steel factories shuttered, or their textiles plants gone, or car manufacturing moving to Mexico. And it was a mixture, a toxic mix of globalization and the fact that these jobs were gone for good, that nothing changed. And so there was a real slow burn after the 2008 financial crash, where if you were on Main Street, you were too small to bail out, but if you were on Wall Street, you were too big to fail. And I think it left a sense in a lot of Americans that conventional politics, whether of a Democrat shade or a Republican shade, had let them down. And Americans felt angry in 2016. And I think there were similar forces in Britain. Now, America is a much bigger country, and America has got a very different history to ours, of course, which goes without saying. But I think there's always been a belief in America that, one, if you work hard, then you're going to do better than your parents did, and you can give your kids a better life. And the idea of transgenerational mobility, that it was always an upward arc, and that people would continually feel better off if they were given the chance. And I think that after the 2008 financial crash, they looked at the steel mill that was still shuttered a year later, 2 years later, 4 years later, 6 years later, and they thought, hang on, so in the circle of economic, surely there ought to be an upswing now. What's happened to the upswing? The top 1% were doing fantastically well. They were accumulating wealth, and there was a sense that people had been left behind, and that conventional politics had failed to recognize that. So I think that was one of the drivers. Another difference I always thought between the UK and the US. The US believes in conspiracy theory. The US have always had, what happened at Roswell, what happened, was there a second shooter on the grassy knoll in Texas when JFK was taken out? You can go back to any number of different things and think of the conspiracy theory that kind of, has always been there and has been in the imagination. And I guess that if you're living in Boise, Idaho, and Washington, D.C. is 2,500 miles away, American government seems a long way away, and so you are much more suspicious about what is being done. And it always struck me that in Britain, we would always go for the cock-up theory rather than the conspiracy. I mean, who could have made up Theresa May's speech to the party conference when all the letters were falling off the backdrop? And she barely had a voice, and some protester goes up and hands her a P45 and rips it up in front of her. I mean, that is Britain at its best. Neil Kinnock falling into the sea, tripping over on a photo stunt. God bless him. I mean, Liz Truss, anything to do with Liz Truss, frankly, is pretty amusing, unless your mortgage has gone up as a result of some of the calamitous financial decisions that she had made. And so I'd always thought that in Britain we had a healthy sense of, politicians, they're hapless. They're not kind of... And yet suddenly I come back in 2022, and I think that this is partly a factor of COVID, that we're starting to believe in conspiracy theories about 5G, about vaccines, about this, about that. There's a deep state. And Liz Truss, God bless her, no, Liz, you screwed up. You came up with a budget that was unfunded. The bond markets took fright. Cost of borrowing went up. Failure is on you. And the idea that it was somehow some machination of the deep state that conspired to bring her down, I just think is for the birds. And so I kind of was really interested in the way that the conspiracy theory suddenly seemed to take hold as an explanation for what was going on in Britain as well. And it just, come on, common sense says it's very unlikely that there was a meeting of tea and biscuits somewhere in Whitehall where these secret dark forces got together and plotted and planned to put down the proletariat or whatever it was. I mean, it was always the Marxist explanation for like 100 years of why revolution had not come to Britain. It was that the capitalist forces had got together to conspire against the proletariat and given them false consciousness or whatever it happened to be. And so I kind of came back and thought, Britain has suddenly started believing in conspiracy theory. And I think that that is also a lot to do with social media, which I think is another major driver. I was just talking to Sophie outside about, whether I like coming to do these events. And I said, I absolutely love coming to do them. And she said, why? And I said, because otherwise you're getting your sense of what the public thinks from Twitter or X. X is not the real world. And politicians should learn that X is not the real world. If I had any advice for Kemi Badenoch that she'd want to listen to, which I doubt she would, it would be, don't spend so much time looking at X. It's not where reality is. And I think that social media has driven people to extremes. That is one factor of our politics. And the other factor of that is that I think voters have become massively impatient. And I think that, let me talk a bit about the media landscape as well, because I think this is quite important as well. And then I'll maybe, I wrote the book and said, my God, can you believe that in the 2024 general election that Labour and the Conservatives only got 55% of the popular vote, which was down like 20% on the 2019 election, which saw Boris Johnson win a landslide majority. So the two-party system has gone, and people are looking for instant solutions to complicated problems. And I think that is the force of populism and the rise of populism that we have seen, not just in America, but in Britain now as well, in France, in Germany. The clock has been turned back, interestingly, in Hungary. The clock has been turned back a bit in Poland. But those forces of people offering you, right, if we only get rid of the immigrants, everything will be fine. If we only do this, then it'll be fine. And it will be easy. I understand, I genuinely understand the appeal of Nigel Farage saying we're going to stop the small boats, which is what Rishi Sunak has said and what Keir Starmer has said. Of course, I think it's absolutely egregious and offensive that people are arriving in this country on small boats and kind of shortcutting the way of getting into this country. My family came to this country as immigrants at the end of the 19th century. You have to come in properly, and as far as I'm concerned, I owe everything, and my parents' view and my grandparents' view was they owed everything to this country for having given them a safe place to live. And I think that, immigrants should be coming here and thinking that. And so I understand why people find it utterly offensive that these small boats are coming. But how do you stop them? And what we're going to do? We're going to send out the Navy, such as our Royal Navy is at the moment, and start blowing these small boats out the water. We're going to tow them back to France, and France put them back across the water. I mean, there aren't I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, we know in our own lives that, even in our familial relations, that things are complicated. And I think that people's desire for instant solutions is just misplaced. And Donald Trump hasn't been able to deliver it. I mean, on immigration, to some extent, he's been able to do a lot with the closure of the border, but there's now an awful lot of people pushing back over what he's doing in Minneapolis right now. And I thought it was a really good thing when Starmer says, before the July 24 election, look, life is complicated. It's going to be slow, hard grind to get things moving. I perhaps hadn't anticipated the mind-boggling incompetence of what we've seen from this government so far. But 2022, which is when this thought started germinating about, why is it that Britain has gone mad? I also saw that the media landscape was sort of also struggling. And it was then that I left the BBC, and I'd started this podcast with Emily Maitlis, who did I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, but she did an interview with this bloke called Prince Andrew. Anyway, didn't work out so well for him. Worked out all right for Emily. That we suddenly found that I would come back from America, and I'd be stopped by young people in the street saying, "Oh, I love Americast. It's a really great podcast." And so we kind of started, it was an awakening, because the BBC at that stage was going through these unbelievable spasms and getting market research which showed that young people were no longer watching or listening to anything on the BBC. And they were endlessly kind of piloting new ways to re-engage a young audience. And so they thought about, maybe if we had some correspondents who had a few more piercings and tattoos, that would get young people. No, it didn't work here. Maybe if we did some issues that young people care about, that would do it. And there was a great occasion where it was the period, about a decade ago, where people were rediscovering their old record players. And they were no longer listening on iTunes or whatever it happened to be, or Apple Play or whatever. They were getting out their old discs out of and vinyl was being sold again. And so the BBC decided that actually this is a good subject, this will get young people. And so they sent a reporter down to Oxford Street with a carrier bag and an LP in it. And just the vox pop was going to be, do you know what this is? So anyway, this reporter goes down to Oxford Street and says, stops this young person and says, "Hello, I'm from the BBC. I'm from the 6 o'clock news. Do you know what this is?" And the kid goes, "Yeah, it's an LP. What's the 6 o'clock news?" Ping light bulb moment for me, because I suddenly thought, actually, why are people listening to our podcast? Why are there so many students doing at university or doing their A-levels who are writing to us and saying, "I thought what you were talking about there about the problems of government or whether there should be proportional representation or whatever it happened to be, that was really interesting. It was a full half hour on it." So anyway, so in the BBC, we then got invitations to do a live show, kind of sort of what I'm doing now with Americast. And so we went to our bosses and said, "We'd like to do a live show." At which point, the BBC went full W1A. I don't know whether you've seen... So people were going, "That's a wonderful idea, John. I think you need to speak to marketing about it." And I go, "Okay, we'll speak to marketing." Marketing say you need to speak to legal. Legal say you need to speak to editorial policy. Editorial policy say you need to talk to Radio 4. Radio 4 say you need to talk to BBC Sounds. And so we've now got an email chain that's got about 500 names on it. I don't think the cleaner in BBC Northern Ireland was on it, but it was surely only a matter of time before it would be added. And by which time the opportunity for doing this live show had gone. And I think that the BBC, I think it is a vital cultural institution. I think it's one of the things that gives us soft power around the world. It's not as big as the royal family. And I saw in America, no one gives a damn who our prime minister is, but they care massively about our royal family. That I thought that actually, and if you look at the audience data research now for, say, the 10 o'clock news on BBC One, which when I was in Washington, was the kind of flagship service that I had to cover. Its average age is over 60 now. There is a huge number of young people who are not engaging in the BBC. And it kind of got me thinking, well, you're just doing it. People don't want it served up in the way that it is currently served up. And, too often, you would hear a piece on the news, and I dare to say you still do, which essentially comes down to, he says, she says, only time will tell, Jon Sopel, BBC News, Westminster. And you think, well, no, that's got to be more to it than that. And during the Brexit referendum, and I mentioned that I came back, did I mention I was on Air Force One? I think I did. And I came back with Obama, and I filed a piece, and Obama had written this op-ed for The Telegraph about why he was getting involved in the Brexit referendum. Now, you can argue whether that was ill-judged or well-judged. I mean, ill-judged, I would say. But he said thousands of young American men sacrificed their lives on the beaches of Normandy in 1944 so that the European continent wouldn't go to war again. And so we do have an interest of a Europe united and working together, and we want to have a close relationship with Europe. Anyway, I filed my piece for the bulletins, and they said, that's a really nice piece, John, thank you very much, but it hasn't got any Nigel Farage in it. To which I replied, I thought wittily, I don't think Nigel Farage was on Air Force One, and I'm travelling with the President on Air Force One. And they said, no, every piece has to have internal balance. And I thought, that's not impartiality. That's false equivalence. If 99 Nobel Prize-winning economists say Brexit's going to be a disaster, and you can find one economist at Huddersfield Polytechnic who says, no, it's going to be a great success, don't present them as equal views. You need to be saying that actually it was very easy to find someone who was going to say it's going to be bad for Britain, but much more difficult to find someone who thinks it's going to be good. And I thought that there was this false equivalence was something that I thought, I think there are other ways of doing it. And so I still passionately believe in the BBC, and I look at Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, and I think you're an absolute bloody hero. And Lise Doucette's currently in Tehran, and I think good luck to you, Lise. And there are some fantastic correspondents, but I think a lot of the reporting is generic. And I thought the podcast world, actually, it's new media, which is where we need to go. I do have some concerns, though, that in America, you do not listen to the news to be informed. You listen to the news to be affirmed. You want to hear your own views coming back to you. So if you're a Democrat, progressive Democrat in America, you would never listen to Fox News. You would never listen to One American News Network. You would never listen to Newsmax. You'd listen to CNN or MSNBC, which is now called MS Now. You don't open yourself up to contrary opinions. And I do think that is something of a problem that we have bringing in. And GB News seems to operate under different rules from the rest of the media. And I don't understand why this is allowed to happen when GB News is under the aegis of Ofcom, like the BBC is, like ITV is. Podcasts are not. We have no restrictions. But, at election time, we will, obey the kind of rules of the Representation of the People Act, and we will, we're not, I still think that we are offering mainstream news, but in a slightly different, more conversational, more opinionated way. And so, we give Keir Starmer one hell of a kicking. We gave Liz Truss one hell of a kicking. We gave Boris Johnson. We're there to hold people in power to account, not say on the one hand, on the other, because I don't think that tells you anything. I think it's a sort of misleading way to deal with news. And so I think there is a problem in the news space that you've got the BBC, ITV and Sky playing by an Ofcom set of rules, and you've got GB News that seem to be under the ruling of Ofcom, but doing their own thing. And so when a presenter was talking about how vaccines had turbocharged cancer in young people, There was no meaningful statistical evidence to back that up. The complaints were made to Ofcom, and Ofcom came back with a really interesting judgment saying, well, it's not a news programme, this was an opinion-led presenter. And you think, hang on, the title of the channel is GB News. Surely there is something in that. And so I think that we do have to grapple with that. But I think that we also have to grapple with the fact that we are living in an age of enormous misinformation and disinformation, and people setting up purity tests that you can only believe one thing, otherwise you're wrong. And, we put people on the podcast whose opinions, we're going to have, hopefully, I think this week we've got a close ally of Trump on the podcast. And I know we will get endless complaints from our listeners and viewers, because podcasts are now watched as much as they are listened to, weirdly, from people saying, why are you platforming someone? No, we're not platforming, we're interviewing someone. But we need to be able to listen to contrary views to the ones we have ourselves. We need at times to be made to feel uncomfortable. And are we sure about our certainties? And that is something else I feel that is happening today, that people are so convinced of their own rightness and don't challenge themselves to kind of think that there may be another viewpoint out there. And I think that is really bad for democracy. And Obama is very good on all of this, saying, stop giving people purity tests about whether they fully believe something. We all have a kaleidoscope of different views. On certain views, I would probably be classed as to the left. On other views, I would be classed to the right. I think that we've got a huge challenge over defence spending. I think I think that we should be spending much more on defence, given the uncertainties of the world, given what Donald Trump is doing. On other issues, I'm probably a bit more progressive. So I think we're all a kaleidoscope of different things. And I think that this idea that you're one or the other is terrible. I was lucky enough to interview Obama. We had bid for an interview, and again, this speaks to the power of the BBC. That U.S. presidents don't do many big sit-down interviews. Donald Trump does endless small interviews, but for a British broadcaster to get a sit-down interview, and I got called at home from a withheld number in Washington, and I was there in Washington by myself, and the phone rings, and it was the White House press secretary saying, "Okay, you've got an interview with Obama next Wednesday." And I was thinking, oh my God. And he was about to go to Africa. And he said to me, you can't put anything on social media yet, because if anything happens and Obama has to go to the Situation Room, even if it's 2 minutes before he's due to walk into the room, the interview's off. So we kind of go there. And it's the first interview I've ever gone to where I've taken a clean shirt, a spare shirt, just in case I spill coffee down myself. The anxiety dreams before sitting down to do an interview in the Roosevelt Room. And so but I'd obviously told my bosses that, and I said the code would be when we post a picture on Twitter of me sitting down with Obama, then we know we've got the interview. The agreement was 100%. Once that interview is done, you go straight back, feed the first clip so we can get it on air instantly, because this is obviously a major BBC exclusive. So I do the interview, and he was charming, and I was nervous as hell. And I asked the first question at about 400 million miles an hour. And I say, oh, sorry, can we do that again? He says, yeah, let's all take a breath. I think I've got something in my eye, actually. Yeah, we'll just take a breath. And he was doing that to me. And it was the first time in my life that, the interviewee was putting the interviewer at ease. The interview seemed to go well. He said some amazing things. And then at the end of I say, Mr. President, thank you very much indeed. And we're all getting ready to run. And he goes, Jon, would you like to come out and see the Rose Garden? The angel on your shoulder is saying, no, Mr. President, I've got to feed the interview back to London now because they want to get a clip on the news. Devil on the shoulder is saying, hell yeah. What do you think won? Hell yeah won. And then he says, do you think your film crew would like a team photo? I think on balance they probably would. Look, I want to get questions from you. Let me finish with this. And I say this as a journalist, and I say this, argue this in the book, which is that I don't care how any of you in this room vote. Reform, Green, Labour, Conservative, Liberal, Democrat, there are an awful lot of parties now. However you want to vote. All I care about, and this is where I think journalism does have a role, and I think there's never been a more difficult time to be a journalist, but never a more important time to be a journalist. I want you to go and vote with good information, not lies that have been propagated on Facebook or X or whatever. I think that journalism has a role to play in having a well-informed democracy. And I think that this is an incredible challenge. I think it's incredibly difficult. But I think that it's a battle that we have to fight, because I see people telling me stuff that they know to be true, which I know to be absolutely false. And I think that we've got to keep our ears open, our eyes open, and have a degree of skepticism about some of what's the things that are being put out there on social media. And I think we need to sort of, in schools and for adults, we need media literacy so that we can see through what is real and what is fake, and that way we'll still have a strong democracy in this country, a liberal democracy with all the values that I think make Britain the best place in the world to live. Thank you very much. The lady there, please, on the front. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Can you explain to us how a man with, at best, the most shaky moral compass on the earth can be elected by a group of people who are massively evangelically Christian?
I don't know who you're talking about. Okay, I do. Okay, I was lying. I do know who you're talking about. Because it was alluring. It was alluring. The sales pitch in 2016 about building a wall and closing the borders, and in politics you can appeal to people's better angels, or you can appeal to their worse angels. I remember being in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I love Donald Trump because he says what I'm thinking, but I'm not allowed to say. There were an awful lot of people who felt that the agenda of Obama, and let's be honest about this, having a black president where in America racism is still the original sin, was too much for them to bear. They thought that the country had become too woke, and they thought that Donald Trump would offer a fresh start. It ends in ignominy. It ends in the disaster, the horror of January the 6th, 2021. And Donald Trump's lied that he had won the election. There is no evidence to support that. He's then impeached for a second time. There is then the New York trial over the money paid to Stormy Daniels, and he gets prosecuted. And Americans don't look at him and don't think, guilty man. They look at him as victim. He's been victimized by the system. And Donald Trump weaponizes that brilliantly and says, I am what stands between you and them. The deep state will come after you. If they can take me down, they'll take you down. And he builds on this. And then you've got Joe Biden, who is not fit to be president and, is deteriorating fast. You then get the attempted assassination in Butler, Pennsylvania, where people do start, and the evangelical Christians start to think that maybe God has put him on this earth for a reason. And I kid you not, the number of people who I have interviewed who've said, he is the living Jesus. I'm not making this up. That people then, and then you get the fact that under Biden, the trans issue, immigration, the economy, those three issues, I think Donald Trump played brilliantly. And for all the ill discipline, total lack of a moral compass, the bizarreness of Donald Trump, the eccentricity, the narcissism, all the rest of it, there was one particular slogan in that election And it ran every Saturday, which is when college football is played. And college football in America, for those who don't know, is huge. So, you know, the Crimson Tide game, 95,000 people will be there. I think of when I was at university that a football match normally involved a couple of girlfriends and a couple of dogs on the side of a muddy, boggy pitch, and that was it. 95,000 would go, there'd be tailgating, there'd be parties, there'd be conference. You know, it would be all of that. And Trump ran this advert which said, Kamala Harris is for them, they, Donald Trump is for you. Really potent advert that talked to the pendulum has swung too far. And I don't want to go into new controversies, but I would hazard to say that in this country as well, I think that pendulum is swinging back as well. And so, and you know, Donald Trump and the number of people who were crossing the southern border had increased massively, and Joe Biden hadn't dealt with it. And, you know, the economy post-COVID was struggling a bit. So Donald Trump had three very potent messages. He'd also had this sense of victimhood that he was able to tap into and weaponize. And fair and square, he won the election.
Next question. There's a lady at the...
Where are we?
I think we're right in the corner at the back there.
God, the really cheap seats.
Got to get here early.
Sorry, I'm a little nervous. Just give me a little bit of time. I am from America.
Whereabouts?
In California.
Right.
Okay, so I grew up with Reagan.
Can we just have it as a short question, just so that it gives a chance to everyone else?
I grew up with Reagan and Obama, and now two-term Trump. And my brain is really scrambled worse than a scrambled eggs. So I have to take myself around to different country to realize on your country to see what it is that you're doing different. So can you tell me, like, to comfort, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but it is really difficult as an American because Trump is the president right now.
I hear you. I know a lot of... I mean, the fact of the matter is that America is a very inward-looking country. I mean, when I used to go there sort of 30 years ago, I'd never felt more cut off from the rest of the world than I did when I was in America, because it's a huge landmass, you know, from coast to coast and from kind of Canada to Mexico. Not much of the outside world impinged on America. And I think that there is a view in Europe that we like the presidents that are European in outlook. So we liked Obama, but we don't like Trump. We liked George H.W. Bush, but not much George W. Bush. And we wanted them to be a bit more European, outward-looking, a bit more sophisticated. And I think that it must... Look, I appreciate... And you can... I was reading in the FT yesterday that, you know, ticket sales for the World Cup in the summer are down. You know, apparently hotels have slashed prices by a third because people aren't queuing to come up. Tourism is way down in America now because people don't want to go. I was in D.C. last week, and it was the first time I'd gone back to Washington since the election. And I've got really close friends, and I haven't particularly wanted to be there while ICE agents are on the streets. And I think that Donald Trump just doesn't give much of a damn about any of that. But I think he is fraying relationships around the world, which I think is deeply depressing, because I fundamentally do believe in the NATO alliance and the Western alliance. And I'm an Atlanticist. I love America. As a kid growing up, I wanted American clothes, I wanted American books, I wanted American records. You know, the whole bit. I was there. When I went to New York for the first time, it felt like a familiar place because I'd seen it in so many movies. And so I think we all look to America as this beacon of hope, and it feels a different place right now. Now, what I don't know is, you know, Trump's got, what, another nearly 3 years, 2.5 years to go, whether it snaps back in any kind of more conventional shape or form, or whether there is a new normal now. I suspect there is a new normal now of, you know, Donald Trump more interested in power relationships and a rewriting of the Monroe Doctrine of, you know, everyone's got their own spheres of influence and backyards, and they're essentially, in Donald Trump's mind, you know, 3 power blocks in the world: Russia, China, America. And Europe doesn't seem part of that, which is why I think that, some kind of retooling of Europe is essential if there is going to be strength. But I still think America is a fabulous, fabulous country. And, I'm going to be quite personal now about this because I am Jewish and I see some of what is happening in Israel and I'm asked to explain it. And I say, I'm not Israeli. Been there a few times for work. Don't judge me by what Netanyahu is doing. And people should not judge you by what Donald Trump is doing.
Next question. If you could put your hands up again, we'll choose the one. Okay, you put your hand up first. You can go next. But we'll just wait for this question.
Hi. I'm wondering if you have a feeling who might be the next president of the USA.
God, that's a fool's errand at this stage, so far out, because it may be, if you go back to sort of, let's say 2005, and you had 2005, and you had an election in 2008, no one had heard of Barack Obama, and so it's perfectly possible that someone we don't even know about yet. I mean, look, on the Republican ticket, Donald Trump will play a decisive role in anointing who his successor will be. So I think the chance of it being a conventional Republican like, I don't know, Nikki Haley or Jeb Bush or someone like that, the chances are very, very slim. It will obviously, I think, be between Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and J.D. Vance, the Vice President. J.D. Vance not having the best time of it at the moment, having gone to Hungary to deliver an Orban victory and then gone to Pakistan to deliver peace in Iran. I'm going to say there's still a little work to be done on those things. I think that Democrat-wise, I mean, lady from California, Gavin Newsom is being talked about a lot. Not convinced about that. Pete Buttigieg is interested. He was the transportation secretary. He's gay, and I don't know. I think America is still a pretty small C conservative country, and I'm not sure whether it would vote for someone who is gay, married, adopted a child. So I don't know about that. There are various different people that I could get really granular and talk about, the kind of senator from Arizona, Mark Kelly, who was once an astronaut, who is, who Trump has gone after. The weird thing about Donald Trump, and this is a kind of, like Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, is in all sorts of problems over public opinion and failure of policy in Spain right now. Trump has attacked him and said that Spain is a basket case and he is a socialist, leftist, madman. What a gift for Pedro Sanchez. Anthony Albanese in Australia would not be the Prime Minister now, but for Donald Trump. Mark Carney in Canada, Liberal. He would not be the Prime Minister of Canada. It would have been Pierre Poilievre, who was the Conservative. And all you need, Donald Trump in international politics has the reverse Midas touch. Things that are gold, he turns to dust. As for the Democrats kind of have got to work out what their identity is, I think, and where they want to fight. And if they think that they want to be like Zoran Mamdani in New York, and my advice would be, such as anyone would be interested, I think that if you try to win from the very left, the center of gravity in America is further to the right than in this country. I'm not sure. But some of the way that Mamdani communicates and the focus on affordability, he's in absolutely the right place.
Oh, yes. Good afternoon, John.
Hi.
Having read your book, Strangeland, it's lovely to see you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for you very much for inviting me here today.
Do you think that the US midterms will actually happen?
It's a great question. Yes. I think the midterm elections will happen. I mean, look, America had a presidential election in 1944. And, when FDR was re-elected, in the middle of a world war. I don't see any circumstances in which Trump can cancel the elections, not even a state of emergency, any of those things. But do I think he will try to interfere in the way that the elections are conducted? Yeah. He will try to nationalize the elections so that elections are run federally rather than state by state or county by county. He will... What about you suddenly worried about a surge in illegal immigration and you send a whole load of heavily armed ICE officers to high areas where there's a high rate of Latinos, Hispanic population, which are swing districts, depend on big turnout from Hispanics to go and vote, and they're too terrified to go and vote because they're just going to be hassled and have to show their passports and have a gun pointed at them, and will they want to go and vote? I think that scenes like that could be possible. I think at the moment, on the current trajectory of Trump's war in Iran, the unpopularity of it, the fact that fuel prices are going up, the fact that, you know, people are not feeling better off, and that even by Donald Trump's own incoherent standards, some of the messaging going out on Easter Saturday saying, you know, using the F word and you're fucking this and that, and then saying, I'm going to wipe out a whole civilization. I think there's even fracturing within the MAGA coalition. So I'm going to go back one question. I didn't mention in who the presidential runners could be, Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host, who is now setting himself up as the alternate the alternative voice of MAGA. I think that Tucker Carlson could be in there. But I think that, look, could there be election interference? Yes. I think that Trump, it was interesting, Trump last week talked about the midterms, and he was kind of doing one of his rambling, kind of where it's always in history, the governing party tends to do badly and you tend to lose the midterms. So I thought he was kind of, setting the stage for the potential for the Republicans losing the House and potentially the Senate as well.
Thank you. A suggestion in the form of a question. People have difficulty locating and understanding Trump. Are you aware of a book called Albion's Seed by David Hallett Fisher, who explains the cultural background to Trump and the fact that Andrew Jackson in the 1820s did many of the same things that Trump has done, and has, as you probably know, therefore, has a portrait of Andrew Jackson on his wall?
In the office, in the Oval Office.
So I just would ask some understanding of the cultural background to Trump.
Sure, and I've said this, that I do think that, I understand why Trump completely won the election in 2016, that there was a set of cultural values that, Americans had been pushed too far, too fast, potentially, in a progressive direction, and they wanted to push the clock back. And Andrew Jackson was a very particular president who didn't follow Supreme Court rulings on, Cherokee Indian land, and kind of was responsible for, some pretty bad things that happened at that time. Yeah, I am aware of all of that. But I think that America, is a divided country, to say the obvious. But it's interesting at the moment that if you, I think that probably Donald Trump has, he cannot go below 30% of the American electorate. There is 30% of him who will follow him over the edge of a cliff, if that's what Donald Trump asks them to do, who believes in his wisdom, who believes that, he is a three-dimensional chess player and a genius of negotiation, even though we've seen the chaotic shambles of what has been unfolding in the past 2 weeks, with the Strait of Hormuz still shut, and Iranians, there hasn't been regime change, the nuclear material hasn't been taken out of the country, they're still able to fire their weapons, and, for all the might that America has shown, Iran has shown extraordinary resistance. So, but that's why I think there is a fracturing of the MAGA coalition, and some of the most prominent voices of MAGA are now leaving Donald Trump. I understand completely the reasons for it, but I'm just telling you, as things stand, if you look at Trump's approval ratings, they're underwater and getting worse. that, and I don't think that people are, and I think if you listen to what I've said, I don't think they're buying into the Democrats in a big way either, other than, we're sick of, we're not happy with what we've got at the moment. So I think that there's 30%, but you look at the independent votes, look at the Hispanic vote. The Hispanic vote was really solidly, comparative in previous elections, Hispanic voters went hugely in with Trump. And they're now swinging back to the Democrats. And if you look at some of the special elections that have taken place over the past year in America, in ruby red Republican states or districts, Democrats have done unbelievably well. There is a backlash taking place as well that I think it would be, Trump is a force of nature, but he's not going to be on the ballot in 2028.
We've got time for one last question. I'm sure that afterwards, when John's signing his book, if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, I've got to go to I'm back in Winchester. I'm going to see old friends for lunch, so I've got.
Oh, okay. So it'll be a very speedy book signing, which Sophie's
there'll
very,
be
very
monosyllabic answers.
So, last question.
Thank you. Following the conversation about polarisation, I was wondering whether you think that centrist government or politics is dead, and if not, what can parties of the centre, like the Liberal Democrats, do to stay true to their values, but also exist in the current political dialogue?
Look, we are in 6-party politics now, or 5-party politics, however you want to define it. I mean, I think it was in the 2019 Boris Johnson election, I think it was something like 75 or 79% of the vote was for the 2 main parties. And that is, if you look at current state of opinion polls, Tories and Labour would be lucky to scrape together 40% of the vote. So we're in a very different era. I do think that some of the politicians we've had, and I'm fully aware that I might suffer, unlike you, from old fart syndrome, where I go, oh, well, back in my day, we had proper, real grown-ups. You had Thatcher and Heseltine, or you had Blair and Brown, or whoever. I'm aware of the danger of that. But I do think that, for example, Starmer, who, wins a landslide, I mean, the political ineptness has been extraordinary in, just the U-turns and the whole mess over Mandelson. And I think it's a question of the leaders themselves. I don't think people have turned against politics from the centre-left or the centre-right or the very centre. I think what they've turned against is the fact that the machine politicians have let them down, and I think there needs to be a massive rebuilding of trust, because I do think that Britain, broadly, whether it's the centre-left or centre-right, would be better off, rather than, I think that ultimately, disillusionment would set in, and I don't know what reform would do on the right. I know what they would like to do in terms of immigration, and I don't believe that, the Green Party and some of the things they're saying. I think, we live in a complicated world where the bond markets are very powerful. And if you start implementing policies that the bond markets don't like, you could be bankrupt very quickly as a country. And so I think that it's incumbent upon, the centrist politicians, in a way that Blair did with Labour, to reinvent itself, to make it seem like a dynamic force of social progress, but also understanding the importance of the market. That shouldn't be that difficult to do. And I'm yet... the people there to kind of advance that argument don't seem to be in the forefront right now. A problem of social media, I think some of the best people who could be in politics think, oh my God, why would I want to go there? Why would I want to give myself up for public life? And I think that is a crying, crying shame.
Well, on that note, anybody that wants to volunteer, stick your hand up. Hello, I'm Sian Searles. I'm the co-founder of Winchester Books Festival. Thank you, John, for such an interesting and thought-provoking talk. I'm sure we could have had you here for 2 hours if you didn't have a lunch to get to. This is why Sophie and I set up the Winchester Books Festival. It's to bring authors to Winchester, to make us think in new ways, question and debate. I'm sure many of us will leave here today discussing what we've just heard from John. If you'd like to attend more talks like this, we have still got tickets available for 2 events this afternoon, and we have one event on the 1st of May with Martin Clunes and one on the 8th with our local author Claire Fuller. If you want to be able to see a recording of this event, we will be sharing details of it on our newsletter and then linking it to our YouTube channel. So please, if you haven't already, sign up to our newsletter. Jon is going to do a very swift book signing with P&G Wells outside at the community stand. I would ask that you let Jon leave this auditorium before you all leave as well. And please, can we give him a very warm round of applause?